Hey everybody, this is Joanna Scott, and you are listening to the Race in the Workplace podcast, a show for DEI organizational leaders that explores race, racism, and racial equity in the workplace. I am a racial equity consultant and founder of the Stamey Street Consulting Group, a consulting firm that specializes in partnering with organizations to help them meet their racial equity aspirations. My goal for you is to move your organization from being colorblind to equity-centered through sustainable, step-by-step changes. Hi, everybody. It's Joanna Scott. I want to give you a little preview of this week's episode. I put together this mini episode to share thoughts on the best time to engage your board of directors in your racial equity journey. You'll notice throughout the episode, I reference the equity why. And I want to unpack it just a little bit for you here. The equity why is why racial equity matters in your organization's work. For organizations with a board of directors, this episode is meant to give some of my thoughts on the best time to engage your board in the process of creating a racial equity why. Hi, it's Joanna Scott here. I am so excited to be with you today. Thank you for allowing me to join you in your day, no matter when you're listening. This season of the podcast will focus on leadership and the opportunities, strengths, and challenges of maintaining racial equity as a practice. In this week's episode, I want to share how and when to engage your board of directors in your racial equity work. I have organized this episode around the questions that I'm asked the most around board engagement. And while this episode is for organizations that have a board of directors as part of their governance structure, other types of organizations may find these strategies helpful, particularly if you're in a large organization and you have a hierarchy as your leadership structure or governance structure. So let's dig into it. Here are the 5 questions I'm asked most often about board engagement. So I'll say that again. Here are the 5 questions that I'm asked most often about board engagement. Question 1, what role does the board have as my organization is figuring out its equity why? So what's the role of the board? Question 2, what is my board's equity why? Question 3, when do I engage the board? Question 4, should our work with the board be facilitated? And question 5, should the board and staff create the equity why together? All right, let's dive into it. Question 1, what role does the board have as my organization is figuring out its equity why? This is a great question. In my opinion, the board has 2 roles. And first, the board should do its own work to contribute to the why. Board members likely have perspectives, thoughts, and opinions about the why that should be considered. So that's the first role, is the board has a role in contributing. Second, your organization will need their buy-in to sustain the work. And this is so critical. If your organization is like many I've worked with, you'll need to have buy-in to release anything publicly. So that's the first thing. So if you choose to take your internal equity why and build a public statement around it, you'll need their approval to move forward. And secondly, you'll need their support to sustain the work. So in my experience, I've seen grassroots efforts push conversations about racial equity and racial justice more broadly. So I've seen that work swell from a staff level. But in order for it to be sustainable, it needs support from leadership at the executive level and the board level, because staff-driven efforts can only go so far, and staff, just by virtue of their positions and roles, often don't have the power necessary to hold leadership at the executive level or at the board level accountable for progress on the work. So it's very important for any racial equity initiative or equity as a practice to be sustainable, for it to have support from the executive and the board level. And like I said, there's only so far that work can go without that support. All right, question 2. What is my board's equity why? Another great question. I think this is an adaptive question. for each board member to grapple with. And I've talked about adaptive work and adaptive leadership in other episodes. I'll link to them in the show notes. But I think that this is an adaptive question for each board member to grapple with. So, from a governance perspective, what is their equity commitment and how will they live into it as members of the board? So, that's like a personal kind of question to grapple with. There's a piece of this answer that is, of course, governance, because that's the function of the board. But then there's another piece of this that's operations, which is the way they do their work. And I would say another piece of this that's personal around your personal why, around why this work matters or, frankly, doesn't matter. There's a tremendous opportunity for disconnect when you have staff living into organizational commitments without the same energy at the board level. So when the board is disconnected from racial equity as a practice, they haven't had the space to grow and learn in their own space within the organizational structure of the board. This matters. So for example, suppose your board represents your organization in speeches or fundraising events, and they're using language that doesn't align with the equity why or with the board organizational values. So in that case, you'll want them to show up in ways that reflect and live into the organization's equity commitment. So there should absolutely be an intention, and I would encourage an aspiration around the board having a clear understanding of an equity why and doing their own work in their own space. So about a year ago, maybe a little longer now, I was on a consultant team and we delivered a board racial equity series. It was an engagement spanning several months where we went deep with a cohort of board members. And one of the things I learned from that experience is that boards need time to soak all of this in, just like the staff do. So if you're responsible for thinking about this work and planning for this work, you'll also want to ensure that board members have time to commit to the work. Board members benefit from shared and independent learning opportunities and time to sit with and process, just like staff do. But often board members don't have time to do that because they're busy individuals, usually with multiple organizational commitments. So I think the importance of the board work in this space, I think, kind of goes without saying. But then there are also some real structural challenges around time and space that often board members don't have either. And so if you're thinking about and planning this work, those are some considerations to hold in terms of securing those commitments before starting deep work with a board. Okay, question 3, when do I engage the board? The sooner, the better. Certainly there is a strong staff component to creating the equity why. That includes figuring it out, wrestling it to the ground, and determining the day-to-day. So staff are going to be much closer to this question, being able to answer this question than the board, simply because they are closer to the work of the organization in an everyday way. So they are just more familiar with what the work looks like and should look like. However, given that, you don't want to wait too long before engaging the board. The danger in waiting too long is that the staff can move too far out in front of the board. And if they have not had a space to participate in that process, then it can lead to a real disconnect with staff. So in this scenario, if we play this all the way out, the board will likely pull the organization back from any newly stated racial equity commitments. And when that kind of retrenchment happens, it can be very damaging, even harmful to staff morale and also to board staff relationships. So the right spot is somewhere between not at the very beginning, because staff also need time and space, and not too far down the road before engaging the board. But as I said at the beginning about when to engage the board, sooner rather than later. All right, question 4. Should our work with the board be facilitated? I would say yes, and that's not only because I'm a facilitator. I say yes. I think it doesn't need to be a long engagement. I think it could be a short engagement with some very specific and discrete pieces of work, but still facilitated. Good facilitation, and I'm emphasizing good facilitation, ensures a safer space for every person, and it enables the executive to participate in a structured way with a deeper sense of purpose. There's power in having those relationships be facilitated because a good facilitator can also manage power dynamics that are happening in the room. And it balances the risk for others in the organization to be able to say things and be heard. So I would suggest yes. And the other piece of that is in bringing board and staff together, making sure that that's a structured space. All right, moving on to question 5. Should the board and staff create the equity why together? I say it depends. Typically, I don't recommend that the board and staff do that work together right off the bat in the same space. So if you ask me that question, which someone did, and you say, Joanna, what do you think? My initial response is going to be no. Some organizations have a very good board staff relations. They have good board staff relationships. So cross-organizational working groups or just cross-organizational conversations is a part of their culture. And some organizations function this way where the board and staff do learning and brainstorming and visioning together. And I've seen this dynamic happen and happen beautifully, not often, but it happens. But my reaction usually is going to be no, my initial reaction. And here's why. The power differentials are so uneven that I never want someone to feel inadequate or incompetent when asked to share their opinion or to share an experience. So from a staff perspective, I don't want to expose staff members to the vulnerability of not knowing something. And if that kind of exposure happens among your peers, you still have to address it, but it's manageable because it's at a peer level. And so I feel the same for board members. I don't want board members to feel vulnerable from their lack of knowledge because their job is to know. And so particularly because staff tend to be closer to the work and closer to the issues, that potential for vulnerability for board members is great. And I think it's critical to consider what the vulnerabilities of each group of people are and what we're asking them to expose of themselves as we think about how to design spaces. So that's why I don't often recommend it. But like I said, in some organizations, it is the culture to come together for that kind of learning. So I hope this episode, which is a little bit shorter than a typical episode, but I hope this episode offered some concrete considerations as you think about when and how to engage a board of directors in your racial equity journey. Certainly, as I have said, there is a role for the board, and it's important to think about what that role is pretty close to the beginning of the work, and certainly not letting the staff get too far out in front of the board. Certainly thinking about if that work should be facilitated or not, and should that work happen in the same space or should it happen in separate spaces, I think are all really important considerations as you think about how to engage your board in your racial equity journey. All right? Until next time, take care. That's this week's episode of Race in the Workplace. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast and share it with a friend who may be a DEI professional who can use these strategies in their work. My hope for the podcast is that it reaches every person who needs it. Until next time, take care.